Hello, fans, and welcome back to another Firaxis live stream. I'm Anton Stringer, your host, and joining me today we have Carl Harrison, who is our usual suspect driver. We have Ed Beach, franchise lead designer of the Civilization series, and David McDonough, another designer on the Civilization series. Ed, how are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm looking forward to this. This is fun. I haven't been on the live stream for a little while, and talking about board games, that's right up my alley.
Yeah, and David too. Both of you actually are published board game designers. David, how are you doing today?
For me, it was just in the past month that my board game came out, but it's a pleasure to be back on the stream. I think the last time I was here was all the way back on Gathering Storm.
Nice, yeah, for some of the scenarios we did on that.
Mhm.
Cool. Well, let's get into the game. So we have Carl today playing as Rome. We're just showcasing some early game gameplay, more as some talking points for us to launch and discuss board games. Because at Firaxis, board games have a very special place in our heart. They influence our design, and we play them for fun. We play them for research. So there's all sorts of really neat stuff going on. And in fact, Ed, I remember when I started as an intern. 9.5 years ago at this point. We were just going into the summer, and I remember one of my first memories of being at Firaxis was, sitting down with you and some other folks in the fun zone, which is our sort of like common area during lunch, and you taught me how to play Seven Wonders, and that was like, one of my first experiences with quote unquote real board games, and that was really fun. It was sort of like a nice intro into like, oh, okay, like board game design can be like this, and that was really eye opening for me.
That's great. Seven Wonders is just such a key game for me in terms of, I think it's a game I've probably taught to over 100 people, just in terms of all the different weekends and everything else.
Yeah.
Because it's just a go-to game I go back to over and over again to kind of get people interested in those kind of historical games. It's actually a game that I have taken some inspirations from in some of my recent board game designs, so we may get into that a little bit. But
Sure.
What I love about it is how there's no downtime for anybody. Everyone is always looking at their own hand simultaneously, and so everyone has something to do at all times, and so that's one thing that you have to worry about a little bit in board games is are you introducing downtime for players, and that game just handles that so nicely.
Yeah, and now that you bring that up, that reminds me of certain things we do in Civilization of like, with some of the multiplayer modes where, players go simultaneously in order to save, again, on that turn waiting time. Because if you go sequential, sometimes you end up waiting around for a long time, even though that's maybe a better balance in terms of like, who goes to war with whom and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, this area called the Fun Zone at Firaxis, we back before we were all working from home, it was a really fun place to congregate. There'd be tons of board games set up during lunch. A lot of the board games will run longer than they might happen at lunch, and so we just kind of leave them set up, and we'd come back to them another day. And David, you and I have played quite a few board games in the Fun Zone as well. Any particular memories? There's one I'm thinking of that was very interesting.
Probably a struggle game. Or
that was one of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was actually during the development of Beyond Earth. You and I set up a Twilight Struggle game in our office.
Yeah.
And as I recall, you engineered, as the United States, an epic and rare, like, last-second tie, because I was clearly going to destroy you.
Yeah.
As the USSR, and we snatched not defeat from the jaws of defeat. But I remember we played in two groups all the way through Pandemic Legacy seasons 1 and 2.
We did, yeah.
Very different experiences between the two titles. I remember, I think it was early in the development of Civ 6. I learned that you had never played Axis and Allies.
That's the one I was thinking.
I remember,
it was traumatic.
Right, I remember saying, "How could you be a Civ designer? You've never played Axis and Allies. We're playing this right now." And once again, I demolished you, but due to an unlucky on your part early win for heavy bombers that I was able to snag as Russia, and I just bombed Germany into
every
nothing.
offensive. I just got bombed into nothingness. Yeah, it was rough.
Which
it was very educational, and I can see like the legacy of that game. So
we actually learned later that the original rules, because we had a copy in the office that has to be 20, 30 years old.
Oh yeah, the box looked way beat
up. It was practically molding, and we learned that the rules were actually changed in later edition because the heavy bomber tech was so overpowered.
Yeah.
And I was like, look, see, even non-digital games can be patched. You just got to go to Google and look them up. Yeah.
So did you get that
Patch it.
actually out of the game library that's sitting there in the middle of
Oh, yeah.
Firaxis? Because that's something we should mention as well. Is not only do we have the game zone, the fun zone to set up games and leave them out there, but there's a huge library of board games going back years. It's pretty crazy what some of the titles that are in there that just sort of sit in the middle of the building.
A lot of the people on our team and in the studio generally also have substantial personal collections. That, like you go into somebody's office and their shelves are stacked high with their favorite games. It's a great way to discover new ones. I remember learning about Twilight Struggle from Ananda when he was at Firaxis, and he offered to play with me, which I didn't realize quite at the time what a rare treat that was as one of the co-designers of that game. But that's how I learned about card-driven games, and that's actually how I got the urge to make one of my own.
Yeah, so kind of pivoting to that a little bit. So Ed and David, you are both published board game designers, and in fact, I've playtested many of your games in the fun zone during lunch because we play all different kinds of things. We play the legacy games, we play shorter games. Some people have miniature wargaming set up, but there's also prototypes of games that people are making. People want to get feedback on. So David, your game Dawn's Early Light, if I remember right, I was one of the first playtesters, which was a really cool experience.
You played a key role. You played it several times early on when it was pretty bumpy. And I mean, it took a long time, so I appreciate your enthusiasm. It was a game that took like 3 hours to play back when it was a prototype.
I played a more polished version a little bit later on, I think.
I think so, yeah. I remember bringing it to EdCon, which is, and if the world doesn't know, Ed's personal board game convention in his house, which is an amazing time. So if you want any testimonials as to how much we care about board games, the existence of EdCon should set that aside.
24 years and counting.
And yeah, it's usual that weekend we test probably 2, 3, 4 different prototypes that people bring in. So we have quite a few board game designers who like to attend there. So that's a fun time.
Another fun experience I had was actually Carl, our driver today, is very into tabletop RPGs. And in fact, he does DMing for several Dungeons and Dragons groups at work. It's a lot easier when we were all in the same office, but he makes it work. And he actually had and released his own steampunk-themed tabletop RPG system called Adara years ago, which I also playtested and was a lot of fun. So yeah, tons of this stuff going around at Firaxis. It's very much in our DNA as a studio. Another fun thing that we've done is we've had the opportunity to partner with Fantasy Flight, a very popular, well-known board game designer and publisher, and they make adaptations of our games. So this is kind of like another example of like it's not just us being influenced by board games, but we then in turn influence board game design, which is really cool. So just a few months before we were all working from home in March, so I think it was earlier this year, don't quite remember, but we actually had the unique opportunity to playtest a new expansion for Fantasy Flight's Civilization 6 board game, which was a really cool experience. And they had sort of taken elements of things that we had added in both the base game and the expansions, and also kind of taken a deep look at what makes Civ special and introduced some of those elements, which we thought were very successful.
And that expansion has just come out. It's called Terra Incognita, if people want to look it up. And they introduced exploration elements into the board game so that now some of those tiles that might have been fixed and known to everybody, you're going to have to go out and send an explorer out and flip them over so you can see exactly what's out there and what opportunities are there. And I think some of the tiles get added around the outside of the board. As you go into place, you're not even sure where they're going to be additional tiles. So that I really like what they did with that expansion. I think they did a great job of making it feel a little bit more like Civ, because there's such a special moment at the beginning of a Civ game when you have no idea what the map is going to look like around you, and you're just trying to start to poke into the unknown and see what that all how that's going to unfold for you. And they really did introduce that to the board game, which is tricky. That's one of the things that's a lot easier to do on the computer. So getting that right on the board game side was pretty cool that they were able to do that.
Yeah, and as we can see, as Carl's playing here, he's sending his scouts and uncovering the fog of war, and exploration in the random map is such a huge part of Civ that I think actually is easier to do, like you were saying, Ed, on a computer than it is sometimes to do in a board game. You can have these sort of random tiles, and the Terra Incognita expansion does a really smart job of that. So there are a lot of things that we have in common between board games and Civilization games, and not just Civilization, but XCOM as well. Really, all of our Firaxis designs. One of the sort of common things that I think we all share is, a board game and a game like Civilization or XCOM represent these giant, huge, like humanity-spanning ideas. For Civilization, you're starting in the Stone Age and you're going all the way up to the Information Age and launching yourself to Mars or getting cultural dominion over the world. And so there are these huge, grand ideas that span, centuries of people and drama. But ultimately, you have to boil it down into a game. And even though our game is long, it still is simplified in a lot of ways compared to the grand span of human history. And board games have like the same challenge, I would say. You have a game like Pandemic, for example, Pandemic Season 1 or Season 2, where they kind of like take this big grand story and they sort of like boil it down into different months and different mechanics that change over time. So ultimately, there's this idea, I would say, of like abstraction, of taking complex ideas and sort of boiling them down to a representation. And that's very important both for board game design and for Axis design. So like Ed and Dave, any particular examples you're seeing as Carl's playing here of things that are complex that we sort of have to boil down into an interesting and fun, sort of more tangible way?
So I think the first one that was sort of kind of part of the core change that we made going from Civ 5 to Civ 6 was to really make each tile on the map tremendously important, and so it itself becomes like a playing piece that you're going to have to choose exactly what you're going to do with it, how you're going to use it, whether it's a piece you need to be controlling, whether it's something that you can let someone else control. So that's why we unstack the cities and spread things out. So just the fact that all those push pins are out there, the map pins, where Carl's planning out how he's going to develop his kind of core cities. And he's going ahead and adding more as he grabs more land. He's deleting the pins once things are in place. To me, that feels a little bit like a board game, maybe like Carcassonne, where you're trying to find just that exact tile that's going to fit in that empty gap, and all of a sudden it's going to make your city, your castle complete, or the road's going to finish.
Oh, if I put a monastery here, I'm going to get tons of adjacency.
Exactly. So. That's the feel that we're going for. Carcassonne's a game I've certainly been playing for a long time, and the board in Civilization is already so important. You're spending so much time scouting it and uncovering it and fighting over the different elements of the terrain. So just making each tile a little bit more unique and a little bit more important and special. Was something that we were really, really happy to do in Civ 6.
I agree with you. Like, I definitely, when I'm designing things and when I'm playing the game too, I often kind of visualize the map as a giant board. And, things like districts are like little tiles that you're placing down, like little physical things. And the units you're moving around are almost like little chess pieces. This is my pawn, this is my bishop. And I think that sort of seeps in. Envoys here, which Carl's actually doing right now, I actually originally imagined as these kind of poker chips, where you're kind of like placing a bet. Like I have 3 poker chips and I'm going to place them on Zanzibar because I really want to get control of Zanzibar. And so you're sort of like investing, but someone else can see that. So that's sort of very physical, tangible, these tokens, these things that are very... unlike the real world, which can be a lot more messy, where things are a lot more continuous, I think, boiling things down into this is a token, this is a piece, makes it a lot more clear and a lot more fun, especially in a game like Civilization or in a board game.
Yeah, I think your point that you had before about how we're looking for abstractions, we're looking for ways to kind of boil things down and simplify it, that's really important. It's not that we're trying to introduce these board game mechanics, and we love board games, and so that's sort of a natural place for natural language for us to engage and talk about things with, but it's really because we feel like the game needs to be simplified, tokenized, turned into discrete elements that people can understand, that can have unique bonuses attached to them, that can be swapped in and out. Carl was just showing the social policy screen in the government. That's specifically set up to kind of look like a card game, and you've got a hand of cards that you can manipulate, and you have to figure out which ones you want out on the table at that given point in time.
I
And
think
it's
we
just
even call them cards, like, definitely in our own discussions and sometimes in the code as well.
yeah, I think we do. So, but it's not because we want to make a board game digitally. We want to represent, the path of human civilization and the epic sweep of it as best
Yeah,
we can. But we also want to make it playable and understandable, and so something that people can, not have take a ton of time to try to learn and how to understand. The nice, simple, chunky pieces that they're working with really helps with all that.
absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How about you, David? Any particularly favorite abstractions?
Well, I mean, I love abstraction as a strategy game designer. It's whether in my own board game or in Civ, it's absolutely essential to pick the right one for the concept that you're working with, especially
For
in a
sure.
game like Civ with so many concepts of kind of different sizes and levels of weight. You can have an individual unit, which is like a representation of a single skilled person or military crowd on a map out to do one very specific thing in one very specific place for only a short time. And then you can have at the same time in the same game occupying part of the player's attention, like a gigantic and global spanning concept like a technology that's under research.
Hmm.
And the abstraction that lets both of those coexist and let the player make sense of it. Like Ed was saying, we need the game to be comprehensible at all times with all of these different ideas floating around. So, like, for instance, the fact that a unit is beautiful and realized and stands on the map and walks around and animates carries the weight of the abstraction of that unit as a real physical being that's actually impacting the future of your Civ. And then technology exists in sort of this purely conceptual place where somehow we describe that you gather up all of the scientific efforts of your whole Civ and contribute them to one grand idea.
Hmm.
Never actually works that way in real life, but by funneling technology through this abstraction, the player can make big, grand decisions like this and not get lost in the details. If technology was as granular as units, it would become really unwieldy to operate. And so this
Right,
is part of
right.
what keeps the game running smoothly and lets the player make big decisions, make small decisions, go back and forth, and keep all of their plates spinning. So as a sort of demonstration of one of my favorites, I think that the unit system generally does a terrific job of handling the kind of abstractions that really make Civ work. Like everybody starts with a small number of them, and you can build more. It's pretty obvious what each one does. Their name is pretty synonymous with their use. But just by making a couple changes, like maybe this Civ gets a unique one, or that one was the first to discover sailing, so now they have naval units, or that one over there got got damaged in a fight against some barbarians, and so now they're temporarily weaker. Like a couple of little bits of shifting inside the unit system can dramatically change the strategic landscape, but without really complicated rules. And that's something that you see a
Right.
lot in board game design. How do we make this game dynamic? How do we make it new every time, surprising every time, require new strategic thought and new situational analysis, but without a fat rule book that requires internalizing all of these nuances and details. Some elegant abstractions and some well-chosen systems are the path to getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah, that's honestly one of the things that attracts me to Civ as a designer, and one of the things that I think makes it really special. And not just Civ, but XCOM as well, and board games more generally, is that you have, even though you have this, these set of abstractions, these kind of like, generalizations that you're making for the sake of gameplay and clarity. At the same time, when you play it, it kind of turns out different every time if you designed it well.
Mhm.
So just because Civ has cities and units every time, and like a warrior is always going to be a warrior, like you're saying, like, oh, well, that's the warrior that got damaged by the barbarian camp, but then he got promoted. So there's these little stories that you start to tell. And like, Carl has Rome and Kume here, but it's not the Rome and Kume from his other Rome game, because of where he placed it, about like, oh, well, I have built the Oracle next to this one. They take on sort of like this special meaning of their own. And so they become sort of like infinitely replayable. And the stories that they generate by kind of meshing with who's playing them and what's going on in their imagination can make them really cool.
Yeah, when it comes to storytelling, we like to say on the Civ team that the player's story is always the story.
Yeah.
You don't have to recreate history. You don't have to be like the Panama Canal doesn't have to be built by the Americans in Panama.
Right.
Um,
It's actually more fun if it doesn't sometimes.
Right. We let you, the player, choose for yourself what pieces to combine and what they all mean, and so that the decisions you make add up to your story, and that's sort of vital to the identity of Civ. And I think that in order to do that, we have to present the player the pieces of the game kind of like a board game does, so that they can make the recombinations.
Yeah.
If I played Tomb Raider, I don't get to change the shape of the levels or the way that the units spawn, or when I might be able to change when I find certain weapons or what my skill tree is. But the part of the game that's up to me, the player, is much smaller. In Civ, all of the parts are laid out on the table for you to place where you wish, and if you are right or wrong about that, if you succeed or fail, it was entirely your call. So that's what makes strategy design such a rich place to design for, but also what makes strategy games such a rich genre to play in. It's up to you to decide what this all means.
So I want to get into that. Reminds me some more details about some of the board games that you two have designed, because similarly to this idea of abstractions, but also you want enough personal storytelling and elements of history to recombine. Some of the games that you've made. So, Dave, you made a game called Dawn's Early Light, which is about the War of 1812 and the struggle between Britain and the fledgling American colonies, which had declared independence and were just starting to get on their feet as a country. And Ed, you made a game called Here I Stand and its sequel, Virgin Queen, which were about these sort of like wars of Reformation in Renaissance Europe. And so one of the things that both of these have in common is they're kind of like a part of a subgenre of strategy games we mentioned earlier called card-driven strategy games. Twilight Struggle is another one in this category. And the idea there is usually you take a conflict, an interesting time in history, so it is based in history, and you have these abstractions like cards are the main one, and like a map and pieces moving on the map. But the idea is that the cards represent these actual factual things in history. So, I remember playing Dawn's Early Light in the early board game, and I think I was America, and I either had played against me or had to play against myself this burning of the White House card, which just totally wrecked my strategy, and I gave Dave endless grief about it. And might have caused them to rebalance it. I don't quite remember, but one of the fun things about the card-driven strategy genre is that you similarly, I think it's much more historically based, and there's a little bit less room to wiggle as a player, because the way that the genre is designed is like you have these cards of historical elements, but you don't necessarily get the ones that you want, right? So like in the burning the White House event example, I might have that card as America, and even though it's not good for me, I'm sort of like forced to play it. Like the White House is going to burn one way or the other. All I can really do is sort of like mitigate when it happens, or try to control like, okay, well, it's going to burn, but I'm like, get my guys out of the way first or something like that. So there is this sort of like, again, like these recombining of historical elements. So at the end of it, you get something like, the War of 1812, but it was a little bit like this instead of that. So I think kind of like more on a micro and more detailed scale, it is similar to a game like Civilization, where you have more specific historical elements at a smaller time, but you are sort of kind of like retelling your own story. Would you?
And I think, I think the key thing that you've mentioned is the way that a unique story comes out in each game. And so if we go back to Here I Stand as an example, there's some cool ways that those historical events can tell a new story. And one of the things that's really interesting about Here I Stand is it's a multiplayer game. So you have 6 people around a table, and you have a phase each turn where you're doing secret negotiations. So you can make deals you can make diplomacy deals that are hidden from the other players, and spring things on people just at an opportune time. So for instance, one of the big events during those wars of those time was the Ottoman Empire kept bringing up a giant army and laying siege to Vienna and trying to wrestle that from the Austrians. And historically, they failed, and a couple times they got there, they set up their siege, but they could never crack that nut, and they had to withdraw. But in a game of Here I Stand, there's a card called Treachery. And what Treachery lets you do is, imagine you have that siege set up and somebody opens the door, opens the gate to the city, and all of a sudden your army can stream in. And because of the diplomatic deal making, you can set it up so that one of the other players in the game, it doesn't have to be the Ottoman who plays the Treachery card to trigger that event happen. So it could be that the Ottoman and the French, who were actually secretly closely allied during that time period, could be the French player that plays treachery on behalf of the Ottoman.
Co-conspirators, yes.
And yes, and so those are the great stories you get. That's not how it happened in history, but the card is there, and that therefore the potential for something like that to happen is pretty great. And you have to, everyone starts getting a little distrustful of the other players in the game. And I saw him talking to the French player. What was that all about? Maybe they are plotting to take me down like that.
Yeah.
So you get paranoia in there. So it's a really rich setting for storytelling to come out of those historical events.
I remember playing, actually, it was at EdCon. I don't remember if it was Here I Stand or Virgin Queen, but I was playing as England. And so I had Queen Elizabeth. And so I remember there was this whole there's this whole game of like, you can pair up Queen Elizabeth with someone else. And it's a very sort of diplomatically advantageous thing if she gets married off.
Virgin Queen, for sure.
Yeah, because she was the Virgin Queen historically. So you
Right.
can play true to history, and she remains the Virgin Queen, and she, rules by herself, which is what I was trying to do. But there's this sort of like string of jilted lovers along the way. so each round in the game, like maybe France wants to pair up with Elizabeth, or maybe someone else does, and so the sort of like, even just on the smallest scale of like, who was Elizabeth trying to pair up with strategically in your playthrough, even that forms its own story, which is super interesting.
Yeah, what was neat about working on Virgin Queen was that Here I Stand games were always better if the players engaged and got involved in diplomacy and talked to each other and went and made secret deals.
Mm-hmm.
But when people were playing the game for the very first time, it was tough to get them to know like what to talk about and how do you start going on making these deals. And so what I did when I was working on Virgin Queen was I actually introduced a system where you have these royal you have cards that represent the royal heirs to your kingdom, and you have to match them up with other players. There's a marriage game that has to go on, because that forced people to get out there and talk to everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't go ahead and marry your people this turn, they're going to start to age. They're going to not look as nice as they did before. They're not going to be as desirable on the wedding circuit. So you just have to go out and play that. And so that led to a lot of the storytelling. And again, it was like using these royal heirs as like tokens within the game, and they're little pieces of diplomatic collateral that you have to go out and make deals with.
Mm-hmm.
But that helped bring the game to life in a really interesting way.
Yeah, that's cool. And I've actually noticed some card-driven strategy game elements in some of the scenarios you both have designed as well. Ed, I'm thinking of Outback Tycoon, and David, I'm thinking of the Black Death scenario, because both of those scenarios use this really cool system where you're playing a game of civilization, but it's it's a scenario, so it's a much more restricted kind of time frame. So kind of in a way, scenarios are kind of like a mini board game within a board game, but because they're so specific about history, because we have more control over the rules, we get to make a lot more dramatic departures, and the sort of abstraction level can change. So in both the Black Death scenario and in Outback Tycoon, you have these events that will happen in the world. And sometimes you get to react to, like David, I'm thinking of the Black Death scenario once where, something bad would happen with the plague, and then you get to choose like, how are you going to react to it? Are you going to double down on faith? Are you going to pivot to culture? And some of these events would even allow you to like unlock new things. So what was in your mind while you were designing that, and kind of like what was the process for that?
Well, I think that it's a straight up continuation of the thread you guys were just describing with Ed's games about how does a game relate to its historical subject matter or its source material. For us, it's always history, in a way that is inspired by it and lets players enjoy it and experience it, but doesn't demand that they recreate it.
Mm-hmm.
It is not essential that, for instance, in Virgin Queen, that you stay virgin. If you knew the history of Elizabeth and you were inspired to try to recreate that, you certainly can. But the game has its own incentives, and you can change your mind and change the course of history for your own little, parallel universe there. And in the Black Death, it was the same idea, and same in Dawn's Early Light. The goal is to give players the experience of what it would have been like to try to survive this time, to figure out your way through this and not know what's going to happen. Like the plague is throwing curveballs at you all the time, and your cities are rioting and falling to pieces, but not in a way you can predict. So you really get to have the emotional journey that a government back then would have had. And these events were a really good way to kind of tentpole that experience. You know, the player can feel like they're getting the hang of the plague. You know, they've got their units in the right place, their cities are protected or recovering, and then an event will come by that was derived from the historic reality. Something like, an example would be all of the nobility who can afford to flee the teeming cities where the plague is rampant. They do so. They just take off, and they take all of their households with them, and that leaves the cities kind of left to nobody but the poor, which is not a good balance. So that was a kind of a socio-political dynamic that occurred. It would be really difficult to make that happen reliably as a rule. So instead we say, well, it's an event, much like the card events in any of our games. This may come up at some point, and when it comes up, you will have to roll with that punch, whether you like it or not. No matter what your preparations are, it could surprise you, and that surprise was essential to the feeling of dread and sort of desperation that the Black Death was about. So yeah, it's about how to be true to history, but let the game still belong to the player, and let the experience be authentic to what you're trying to represent with your game.
I think one thing that we should also mention in terms of historical events is the random event system that was introduced with Gathering Storm. So that's mostly based on natural events,
ago,
but we've seen a flood, we've seen a drought. Carl's bringing up the menu for us here. There's a whole event history tab, so you can kind of go through and see all the different traumatic things that have happened in your world. And I think that's terrific because it makes the game world feel more alive. It makes it feel like you're not playing on a static map that's just a board. It makes you feel like it's actually, a real planet that, is blown hither and yon because of weather effects or climatological effects, or just the fact that you chose to settle near a volcano or a river, and you're going to have to live with the consequences. You'll get plenty of benefit from it, but you'll also have to know that there are going to be time periods where you have to rebuild, and that again is a way to sort of just allow emergent story to come out in your game. So you're sending this army, somebody's coming to attack Rome, and they happen to march right by a volcano, and half their army gets reduced to half strength or less because of the volcano blast going off right as they go by. Those types of things. Those are the kind of stories that you want to share with your friends. Those are the ones that you see in our community. People are like, look at what what Mount Vesuvius did to my city and my empire. I went from 10 population of the city down to 3, and those kind of things. So that's why we wanted to introduce something like that with the Gathering Storm. We just felt like that was just going to allow players to build their own story at an elevated level. We had to be very, very careful with it. We had to make sure we didn't feel unfair or like they were hit just at the wrong time. So
I remember that was one of the earliest things you put in to the expansion, because you knew we would want to test it and balance it a lot.
And even it had been tried in previous Civ titles. I think all the way back to Civ 4, and Firaxis in general, there were several people, Sid had even came in to talk to me about it, and it's like, you got to do this very carefully because we've tried it before and it hasn't always gone in smoothly. So we worked out the plans for that, and I did talk to Sid about exactly what the plan was going to be, and so yes, we had to prototype it early and make sure that it went through 3-4 different balance passes to where it felt right.
For me, I had a very similar experience with Dark Ages and the expansion before that with Rise and Fall, because Dark Ages similarly were something that had been kind of tossed around with ideas for designing a Civ game for many times, but it was really difficult to know how to do it right, because it has the same risk where it can be very unfun or punishing. And so I put it in very early, iterated quite a lot on it, and made sure that it wasn't too punishing, and that it was worth the trade-off, both mechanically in terms of what you can get. So you get the heroic age if you make it out of the Dark Age, and the Dark Age gives you access to some cool dark powers that you wouldn't otherwise have. But also the storytelling, right? Because it's such a huge storytelling boon to have these like giant abstractions laid over an entire era of, like, I was in a golden age, or I was in a dark age. So yeah, they are those elements do take a little bit They're a little trickier to do right, but I think they can be really, really worth it.
And one of the things I really liked about the age system was how you did make sort of natural storytelling moments, things that would give you points towards the next golden age and accelerate. So things like circumnavigating the globe is one of the huge accomplishments within the age system, and it was something like that I always wanted to do as a Civ player. I always want to let me see what the whole map looks like. I got to know what I'm playing on. I have to figure out whether my navy can get everywhere it needs to.
Yeah.
So getting out there and exploring the oceans is always a critical part of the game. But up until the Rise and Fall expansion, there wasn't a huge reason, sort of gameplay wise, that you had an impetus for that.
Right.
Although if you look at the history of the Renaissance in real life, obviously that was critical to powers like Portugal and Spain and some of the other naval powers. So it was really cool to be able to see, now I see where circumnavigation is going to be really important. And the fact that just getting your first ship out, getting your first airplane out, all those things are just worked into that system. I really like the storytelling that brings.
Yeah, and the storytelling was very much in my mind when I did that. In fact, in earlier versions of those historic moments, they didn't even have any gameplay to them. They were just like, hey, this cool thing happened. It was almost like just a here's the story of your game, and we wanted to show it for you. But as you had both mentioned earlier, you got to be careful because ultimately it's the player's own story. So we had to be sure that, hey, here's a cool thing that happened. Hey, you circumnavigated the world. Here's the date you did it. Here's, like a picture that commemorates it. And it goes in your timeline of, well, it happened before this, but after this. So it kind of like folds into the fabric of your own unique story in your game. But we don't want to be too heavy-handed about it. Yeah, so Carl has the timeline up right there. Because if you start in a game like Civilization, like we're not Tomb Raider, right? To use that earlier example, there are tons of different games with tons of different benefits and trade-offs. The advantage of a game like a tightly controlled, story-driven third-person action game is that you have very talented level designers and script writers and voice actors that sort of tell this compelling story, and you have room to wiggle within that. And it's very fun. I play games like that. I love games like that. But what makes Civ special and XCOM special and board games special is that the space is much wider and you have a lot more control. And if you bring your imagination, the stories can be really compelling and unique in a way that I think only games can do, which is really cool. So we had to be sure to add the sort of like the abstractions, the elements, the cards, to let you combine, but we can't be like, this is your story. This is what you're supposed to do. You must recreate history. It's a careful balancing act, just as balancing the economy or the combat strength of the game is a careful balancing act.
I think one thing that's important about a Civilization game, especially Civ 6, now that we have such a huge content catalog in terms of all the natural wonders and civs and everything like that, is that we have all those pieces from history that could be in your game.
Right.
But you don't know that they're going to be there. And so that just helps you, the moment of uncovering something and the moment of discovery that, oh, Genghis Khan is in this game, or I think it was the Matterhorn that Carl just found with his Explorer, the natural wonder there.
Are like that, yeah. City-states are like that, and great people.
Right.
Well.
So we purposely want such a big catalog that all those elements that played cool roles in history are gonna be in the games if you keep playing Civ over and over again, but in one particular game they're gonna combine together in different ways. It's sort of like having a giant deck of cards and you're gonna play, but initially you only deal out half the cards and the other half are left aside, and so
which ones are
which ones are going to be in play is or building a magic deck, and you're configuring a deck and you want it to, these are the pieces you want to use at that particular point in time, but you love some of those other cards that you're not bringing with you that time, but for this particular playthrough you're going to tailor it a different way. So it's the same idea.
I gotta take a brief aside and talk about my boy Crassus here that Carl just recruited, our great merchant. Thanks, Carl. Yeah, because this is totally what you were talking about. When we did the research for the Great People system in Civilization 6, we wanted real people from history. We wanted them to have more personality than they did in Civilization 5 and games previous. And so what we did was, we not only found the people from history, but we found unique abilities that sort of were suited to them. We had this great technology called the game effects and modifier system that allowed us to kind of be much more flexible with how we design game bonuses. So that opened up the door for great people and city states through the systems that I was working on to have a lot more unique effects. And there's the circumnavigation. Hey, cool.
I knew it was coming soon. I
I
kept
wasn't
looking
even
at
looking
it.
at that. Oh, that's
No,
great.
I was like, Carl must be thinking about that. So
Yeah,
it
it's
came
clever.
through for us.
Rare land
Say.
circumnavigation. I think that scout walked around the globe.
Yeah. So Crassus and some of the other so Crassus's deal, I remember this because of the research we did. You know, he was such a rich guy in ancient Rome. Like, I think if you correct for inflation and stuff like that, he's still one of the richest people that's ever lived. And so his abilities, he can activate on tiles that are right outside your borders, and he just buys them. He can do this like 5 or 6 times. I forget the latest balance on him, but and that's really cool because you know, some games Crassus might show up, some games he might not. Some games you might get him, some games someone else might beat you to him. And so that and we got Calais here with grabbing resources as well. So those are great people you find. And in fact, so like I don't have my own published board games to draw inspiration from, but I have played a lot of board games in part thanks to you both and the other folks at Firaxis over the years. So there are a couple games that I was sort of inspired by, and like the Great People system in particular. You know, there's this idea of you know, these great people that become available over time, and as one is earned, another one comes to fill its place. And over time, you know, as Crassus and Calais are recruited, then you'll get sort of like you know, other more advanced merchants from like the medieval or the Renaissance era that come and are available next for a greater price. One of the games that I think you had actually originally recommended that I take a look at when I was designing this was a game called Through the Ages, which is a board game, kind of more of a card game in a lot of ways. It has a great digital adaptation. I've played quite a bit as well. But the big sort of mechanic in Through the Ages is you have this timeline of cards at the top, and it's sort of like this global drafting thing. So you have, you know, a couple different players playing this Through the Ages game, and like Civilization, it is this story of going from the Stone Age all the way to the Space Age. And so in Through the Ages, you have this giant timeline. It's kind of like your tech tree in a lot of ways. So, you know, on the left of the timeline is the stuff, you know, like your equivalent of like warriors or like pottery. But then as players, you know, pick, I want this card, I want this card. And, you know, different ones show up in a different order every time. It ends up with a unique playthrough, and then things slide to the left and take their place. So that was kind of in my mind when developing the Great People system, this idea of like, you know, you earn something, but then something more advanced comes to take its place.
And that's a card drafting mechanic, which you know, Seven Wonders is also sort of a card drafting game as well.
Drafting is one of the
With
abstractions we definitely know a lot about.
yes, and so the game I'm working on right now, which is a wacky game set in
Border
16th century
Reavers.
Injury, Border Reavers. That's which both David and Anton have played quite a bit and helped me out with. That's definitely a card drafting system as well. So, but I think that's a really cool mechanic. The fact that you see a few cards that are out there as opportunities right now, and some of them are going to be very tempting for you to just, you know, stake your claim and go out and get them. But you know that as soon as those are replaced, they're going to be even better cards coming along. So, you know, do you go for this one now? Do you wait a little bit? There's a lot of interesting interplay there.
For sure. So one quick note on Through the Ages, fun fact, at least in the digital adaptation, Sid Meier himself is one of the great people, the leaders that can show up in the game. I think that was a little nod. I think there's definitely some shared respect amongst those two games. I think his ability, he only comes in like the very late game. If I'm remembering right, I think he takes science and turns it into culture, which is like, hopefully that's what video games do.
Okay.
So I gave a thumbs up to that. I thought that was fitting. A lot of the leaders in the late game, and we have this similar thing in Civ, like, you know, as the game continues, things need to get more powerful because everything sort of scales up. So a great merchant that gives you, you know, 100 gold in the classical era, that might be like really cool, but, you know, in the information era, that's like, what, I make that in one turn. I don't care. So yeah, things need to scale up. But as they get towards the very end of the game, you know, maybe even 1,000 gold isn't enough because you're trying to win. The game is shifted into like, okay, well, I'm trying to like bring this game to an end. I'm looking for different things maybe than I was before. So the great people have to take on a very different role than they did before. Less engine building and more of a kind of like going for a specific victory. So other sort of like board game mechanics that are very much a part of Civ. engine building, which I had just mentioned. It's not really a type of game, I guess, but it's an element in a lot of board games. This idea where you're sort of like, starting out with very few resources, but then you get this synergy going and things start humming along. And if you build your engine well, you get like the inputs and the outputs all perfectly balanced, then you can be very effective. And Civ is very much like that. You're building an engine of districts, of buildings, of science income, of culture income, of food and production. Another abstraction that we like to think about a lot is worker placement. So districts, in a way, are worker placement. I love worker placement games. The worker placement game genre is basically you take, there is you have a limited resource of workers. They could be little plastic figures. In Civilization, there are things like governors, and within each city, there are the individual citizens themselves. It's like, where do you place that? What are you going to optimize for? Is this more important than this? And you sort of have to decide. So Ed and Dave, any thoughts about like those like worker placement and engine building mechanics in Civ, and like any things that you've kind of seen in board games that inspired that?
The engine building is sort of classic at the heart of strategy design. Like the concept of engine building could almost be the definition of every Euro game.
Yeah.
I want to like maximize my flows. It's like the accountant's game, my ins and outs until I'm like burning out all of the points. I mean, I remember, I'm sure you guys too, the period of time when Firaxis went collectively crazy for Dominion.
Oh man.
When it just came out, which is a card drafting game, but it's also a very fast and very sharp engine building game. Like, how can I engineer a series of perfect hands that will get me a province every time?
Yeah, you're trying to maximize, get the. And there's different ways to do it, and ultimately replayable because of what's in the middle. Yeah, you're just like, how can I get the most income and like get my cards to line up in a certain way and increase the probability of that? Yeah.
It's not as open-ended as Civ because you have the same kingdom cards as everybody else, and you can pursue an identical strategy to another player, and there's nothing really to stop you. Civ has got a lot more of kind of a wrestling match at the beginning, where you were wrestling for land, for access to the favor of city-states or great people and other things that are sort of collectively points of competition that if you get or don't get, it might change your strategy and you might have to pivot. So it's not a pure map, but that kind of game, or Seven Wonders is another excellent example. But any like Agricola, Brass, there's lots of. I mean, we could spend the rest of this live stream just rattling off board games we've played with like good, solid engine building mechanics, and every one of those has influenced, from an individual system, like the building your engine of science, shall we say, which weaves in lots of different parts of the game,
right?
To how science is itself just a cog in the larger engine of the whole Civ.
Yeah.
And all of the ways that those things layer,
engines within engines.
Engines within engines. Yeah, we're always going back. I mean, the same principles apply. It's like engineering. Haha.
Yeah.
That like a good engine building approach to an individual city and its land layers to an engine building approach to a combination of cities, which layers to a whole Civ-wide strategy, which layers to an entire game and its victory run.
That reminds me of a concept I personally call interleaving, which is, you have these different engines running in a game like Civ and a lot of good board games as well, where you have, here's the culture engine, here's the science engine. But I think there's like a Goldilocks zone, right? Like if you have the culture engine off chugging along and doing its own thing in isolation, that's maybe a little bit fun and interesting. But if you're only making choices about culture, it kind of gets boring. Same thing for science. On the other hand, you could have them all kind of like smashed together, and like culture and science are all flowing around in this big wibbly wobbly mess, but that gets super confusing and hard to track. So I think you have them sort of like in a Goldilocks zone where it's just right, where you have kind of like a big Venn diagram of, the culture system kind of overlaps here with the science system and the gold system. And so you have interesting ways in which you can take culture and kind of feed it as an output into other systems. And those other systems in turn can be inputs into the culture system. And if you have those kind of like, carefully designed conversion pathways of like, I am a strong science player. That doesn't mean I'm just good at science. I'm also kind of good at military because I unlock the more advanced units better. So that's a way in which one engine can kind of like give you a leg up in another engine, even if you're not quite as good at it.
And I think the good example of what we've done recently in sort of that area, it was with Civ 6 when we split the tech tree into the tech and civic tree. And so we had to make a lot of interesting decisions about what was the civic tree going to be good at and why was it going to be so important that you would, win some games because you went all science and you blew through the tech tree faster than the civic tree. But there were also games where you were at a huge advantage because you were pushing culture so hard and were getting through the civics tree much faster. And so things like the ability to organize your army into corps and armies and armadas and fleets, that's all comes from the civics tree. So you might have the technology to build a strong army through the tech tree, but the ability to organize and
you don't have the
mass
logistical
troops
prowess.
and have the logistics, and all those came out of the civics tree. So it was really interesting to try to decide what those splits were going to be and try to like all the social policy and government behaviors all come out of the civics tree. And so that was a nice clean split to be able to have that segmented over in that part of the game. But that's a great example of being able to segment things so that we want some ways to convert things back and forth, and maybe like a boost in one tree will help you in the other tree, but we didn't want it to be that you could just take science and do whatever you wanted with it. The science only had a special role, the culture had a very different role.
Yeah, it's got to be just right, the distance between it. Yeah. David mentioning brass actually reminded me, one of the other things that we'll sometimes do at Firaxis, and most of the examples I can think of are actually from back during Civ 5, but sometimes when we're designing a system, we will kind of do R&D and design brainstorming by finding board games that either have mechanics or themes or both that are kind of like maybe similar to what we're doing. So brass, I remember actually Ananda Gupta, when he was back at Firaxis, sat down with me and some of the other Civ designers, because we knew that we were going to add trade routes as a new feature in Civilization 5 Breaking the World. And so, it came up in conversation, I think, during lunch, maybe while playing another game in the fun zone. It was like, oh, hey, there's this really cool economic game called Brass. And so we really wanted to try it out. And almost none of the mechanics made it into Civ. Like, we didn't really, adapt specific things from Brass. But it was really good to, play that and get into the headspace of, oh, okay, here's a game where, you have economic competition. But unlike Civ, there's no military, there's no conquering, there's no culture. It's just kind of like economics and economy and resources. And so it was a really interesting exercise. And so sometimes we will sort of pinpoint let's play that game. Another sort of fun one I remember, also during Civ 5 when we were making the espionage and the spy system. Ed, you actually dug out. You have a very impressive shelf of board games at home, some of which are collecting dust of their own.
The problem is it means I can never get rid of a game. I have collected all these since back in the 70s, and now I'm like, but you never know. I might need this spy game to help us get inspiration for the Civ 5 espionage system. So
you never know when you'll need it.
Well, them are actually really good games. That's actually a really great game about the different secrets, including the atomic bomb, that were being traded around Europe, and the different organizations were all trying to do espionage and counter-espionage to protect their secrets or to try to get them from the enemies. So I don't think we used any mechanics from that game either. But the good thing was that our designer at the time, Scott Lewis, who was working on that system, he just needed some more inspiration, some more thoughts, just to kind of break the lock that he had in terms of where he should go with the system. And so just getting him exposed to some more ideas, and sometimes a board game with the right theme will do that, was a great way to just sort of jumpstart his work in that area.
And inspiration, and design thoughts and brainstorming are funny things. You can't really predict exactly what's going to give that spark. And so sometimes it's playing a board game and being like, I do not want to do that. You never know. I remember when we were playing the Spies game, it was interesting because it actually starts to shine a light on some of the things that we've talked a lot about, how board games are awesome and how we at Firaxis love them, and how similar in some ways they are. But Firaxis games and digital games in general also have a lot of really big differences from board games and things that we intentionally do differently. And the Spies game actually shines a light on one of those. If I'm remembering right, the spies would kind of go around and they'd have different secrets or hidden information. And the way this was represented is they would have, these little cardboard chips, and, they'd be hiding things underneath them. And it's well, you had to keep it face down. And if if someone got to be in the same city and take a look at it, they got to like, turn it face up and be like, oh, okay, that's what that is. So there's all this hidden information, right? Like there's this whole other layer to the map of things that like you could or couldn't know based on the rules of the game and who you were and all that sort of stuff. And it was really cool, but as a board game, it was kind of finicky. But when you bring a mechanic like that into a digital space with all the tools that a game like Civilization or XCOM have, it becomes a lot easier to visualize those things because you have a computer and you have a user interface and you have the computer on the back end that can do all this bookkeeping for you.
Or actually, it's easier to not visualize things. You can actually, in the Spies board game, you knew where every single spy was on the map. Some of them would be back in London at MI5 headquarters or whatever, and but as soon as they sent one into Rome, you saw a piece going. Now they could flip the counter over, so you didn't know which spy it was. Was it a really good top secret agent that went, or did he just send a low-level guy just to try to do some reconnaissance there? Yeah. But you knew that somebody had gone in there. Where and that's what's great about the computer game. We can actually keep all the pieces hidden until just the right time and reveal them then. And your huge advantages in terms of being able to show. I mean, right now Carl's showing how the fog of war is pushing back on the map, and so what would we do without the fog of war?
Yeah, fog of war and like unknown territory is as simple as it seems and as fundamental to Civ as it seems. It's like almost impossible to do well in a board game. Like you see,
and we were talking about Fantasy Flight doing it before, and in the Terra Incognita expansion, it's one of the best representations of that I've seen in a board game, but it's still very, very difficult.
Right. Yeah. It's a challenging problem. Yeah. Some other things too, like we in Civilization 6 have really leaned into what we call this lens system, where you can look at the game with different layers of information turned on or off. Some of them are what we call contextual lenses. So when you have a religious unit selected or a trade unit, we'll be like, oh, you probably want to know religion information. So let's bring up, here's the religion view of the world, things that are normally hidden but are relevant to you at that moment. And then you sort of have like turn on and off lenses as well. If you just want to see, hey, show me that view of the world, or hey, where are the continent boundaries and that sort of thing. And that's again something that's really hard to do in a board game. The religion system in particular, and the loyalty system too, where you have these like sort of pressure waves emanating between cities that will sort of like reach a threshold and tip things one way or another. There's a lot of math that goes behind the scenes. It's very carefully balanced to give the right feel, but maintaining that in a board game would be super annoying and tedious. There'd be like, okay, everybody take your turn, and now let's do the part where we add up all the numbers and like do all the annoying parts. It'd totally slow down the flow of the game. So like Ed, since in Here I Stand, I know a big part of that game is religious conversions. And so how is that different when you brought that idea of religion to Civ 5 and then Civ 6?
So the big difference is there's no continuous pressure. There's no like these four cities are all Catholic and there's a Protestant city in the middle. So turn by turn, the pressure is going to start to accumulate, and finally that city will flip. We can do that in the computer game. Mm-hmm. In the board game, there's still a representation of it, but it's during the instantaneous action. So if a missionary goes into that city and tries to convert it back to Catholicism, you get die roll modifiers or extra dice or bonuses for having those cities around it exerting that pressure. But it's only at that point in time, that sort of the instantaneous moment of conversion, that you can get that bonus effect. Whereas in the computer game, we can do things like systems that slowly drain or exert pressure on things over time. So that's kind of the big advantage that we have in the digital world there.
Yeah. Well, cool. That's about all the time we have for today. Ed and David, thank you so much for joining me today. Carl, thank you for driving. I want to remind everybody that if you do want to jump into Civilization, if you haven't experienced a game like this before, maybe you're curious about all the sort of board game things we've talked about today, feel free to give it a try. The latest content that we have is called the New Frontier Pass. We are about halfway through a year of continuous updates, some of which are paid, some of which are free, even if you just own the base game. So check that out. There's a ton of great digital board game adaptations available as well. It's a great time. It's a great way to keep in touch with friends during quarantine, I've noticed. So I would encourage you to check those out. But other than that, thank you so much for joining us, and take care and be safe.